Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Willett, and I am your host for this session this morning. I work in the Anglophone East School District in Moncton, New Brunswick, and I'm also the host of a podcast called My Creative Classroom, the official podcast for the Anglophone side of the Atlantic Education Summit. We are proud to be supporting this summit and everything that it stands for. Go check out our interviews with keynote speakers as well as session givers over at My Creative Pod on Twitter, as well as on the website, connected-community.ca. This morning, I'm excited to introduce our speaker. We'd like to first of all thank Dell, who is the keynote sponsor for this morning's session with Nelson. So I'd like to introduce Steve, who is from Nelson as I work towards. So I'd like to introduce Steve Brown. Steve Brown has made his mark in Canada and internationally by leading organizations through digital transformation. His career spans a diverse mix of industry and technology experience, from multimedia entertainment, automotive, and now to learning solutions. Since joining Nelson in September 2016, Steve has transformed the vision for his 106-year-old company by reimagining the role and purpose of a publisher in 2017 and beyond. Implementing an internal infrastructure focused on student and educator experiences allowed teams to look beyond learning resources and look at the fundamentals of student engagement. He has reframed the organization's digital competency by instituting a technology department comprised of some of the world's best and brightest talent based in Silicon Beach, California, resulting in the creation of Edwin, a world-class digital learning ecosystem. Since its launch, Edwin has disrupted the K-12 landscape in Canada and around the world. In 2019, it was recognized by EdTech Breakthrough, a leading market intelligence organization that recognizes the top companies and solutions in the global educational technology market. Selected among 1,500 applications across 12 countries, Edwin was awarded the Publishing Software of the Year and Best Technology Learning Platform. Steve is a strong believer in the transformational power of education and the role it plays in building a stronger society. As the education landscape continues to evolve, the K-12 and post-secondary markets started to move at different speeds. Steve saw the need to increase attention on student engagement in order to prepare students for post-secondary success and future workforce readiness. In March of 2020, this century-old organization retracted from the post-secondary market to deepen its focus on K-12 education and technology. As Nelson looks forward, it will continue to transform the learning journey by leveraging global partnerships and emerging digital technologies in the development of our resources. The delivery of leading edge experiences will foster continuous learning growth, student engagement, and educator success. Steve's passion and commitment to transforming education and the student learning experience continues to fuel the innovation pipeline at Nelson. So I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you, Steve, as the presenting sponsor at Nelson. And for anyone, as Steve is speaking this morning, feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A below here on Zoom. Steve, on behalf of the Atlantic Education Summit, welcome.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm delighted to be here. Good morning, everybody. Let me just share my screen. I listened yesterday to many of the sessions and enjoyed greatly the session and the walk around with VR. Before I start my presentation this morning, I thought I may just actually frame a little bit of a story and a little bit about me. It's somewhat of an unorthodox journey that brings me to lead Canada's oldest and largest educational partner and educational publishing company. As I often say, today we are the world's oldest and largest edtech company, which is somewhat oxymoronic. Nelson was founded in 1914. Actually, it was founded before that in Edinburgh in Scotland, but in 1914 it set up actually as a Bible publishing company here in Toronto. Later in 2014, it started producing textbooks for the schools here in Toronto, and its history, as I'm sure many of you know, has been long and storied since that point. My journey to Nelson actually started a year earlier than I actually joined, when the board of directors at Nelson tried to get me to join. And At that point, I'd been involved running one of the world's largest media companies for just under 9 years. And we'd been through the transformation from physical to digital. Prior to that, I'd spent 20 years running global public automotive companies and had lived in 3 continents around the world. When the board of directors approached me to come and run Nelson, I told them I didn't know anything about education. They reminded me that a speech that I made at MIT in 2009 had also said I didn't know anything about the movie industry. But what we'd done in transformation over the next 8 years was somewhat transformative. The one thing that I would say is common in the 3 industries that I've worked in is everybody believes that they're individual and distinct. That's not how we do it, is a phrase that I often heard. No, that's not how it works here, is another one. You don't understand, you've only been in this business for a few weeks. To which my answer is always common. Sometimes my greatest single strength and attribute is ignorance. And that's an unfortunate phraseology to use when you're talking about education, but not ignorance in terms of the product, not ignorance in terms of the great pedagogists that we've got working with us, producing learning materials for students, but ignorance in terms of why can't we do that? Just because it's never been done, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. And often when you meet those barriers, once you've met them 3 times, you see them as an absolute barrier thereafter, and you never question it again. I have some personal weaknesses to be able to accept that. Anybody who's on this call who knows me knows that I can be somewhat contrarian. But eventually I agreed that I would join Nelson when I realized that the team that I had was world class. All they needed was a vision to be able to steer the future. One of the phrases that I heard at the very beginning of my time was, well, we've been around 103 years. And that was a belief that gave them a rite of passage into the future. To be able to stir them up to believe that we needed change came in one sentence. A lot of people die when they're 103 years old. And it's not the last 100 years that matters, but it's the next 100 years. I knew I would be able to turn Nelson into a transformative business. It was already a great company with a great reputation and brand, and a trusted one with teachers and administrators and parents across the country. But it needed to earn its right into the next 100 years. So I decided to look at student engagement. And I had my team gather a lot of numbers. And as I go through this presentation today, I'll tell you a little bit about the journey of Edwin. And whilst this opening is somewhat hyperbolous, there's a reason for it. The reason is, when I was asked to come and run Nelson, I knew I would be able to build a team, transform the company, and leave it to go forward with the educational partners around the country that we'd worked with for the last 100 years. I knew I'd be able to do that because that's my management style. Disruption, transformation are things that you can do in any industry. What I didn't know is that I'd fall in love with education, and that's where we are today. It is the most consuming and all-embracing area I've ever worked in professionally, and it's something that I'll be in for the rest of my life. So let's move forward. Leadership. For those of you who are on the call today, particularly in these times of COVID-19 and our new norm as we move into September and beyond, this is the only slide we really need to talk about. Leadership is an attribute to which everybody believes they have and very few truly practice. In COVID-19, we've been dealt questions and situations like never before. And the leadership that's been demonstrated to be able to protect our community is one that has not risen yet to the challenge, but it can. And leadership is not a team sport. And I talk daily with educational directors, superintendents, deputy ministers, ministers across the country. And the varying levels of preparedness for September are stark. And to me, it all comes down to leadership. The thing that I first heard the week of March 15th when I talk to leaders was, if we give our teachers one more thing to do, their backs will break. And the community was stifled. The community was having things thrown at it in such a dramatic fashion. Here, take this for free, sign up this for free. And our team came to me and said, Steve, what are we going to do? And I said, we're going to do the same thing that we've done for 104 years. Everything that we have that's available for every single province, school district, and board across the country, put on a site called My Nelson and make it for free. Make sure there are no more than 2 clicks to access it. Email everybody and tell them it's available, and then leave them the heck alone. The one thing that happened in the first few weeks was everybody jumped on this as an opportunity. And I said, no, we don't go and talk to anybody. We don't offer them anything. We don't try and talk to them about this solution or that solution, because right now, the amount of things that they're being offered is driving to indecision. Indecision drives to a lack of engagement, and a lack of engagement drives to a lack of outcome. So we started to say, okay, there are all the resources that are available to you. And I turned my whole team onto a focus for September. And that's where I think we should be at. And as I walk through this presentation today, I hope that we'll be able to show you that Nelson, to you, is a partner. And not in the way that we've always been perceived as the big textbook supplier, but a partner in solution, a partner in learning, a partner in innovation, and then a partner in delivering a solution that is agnostic to location. For the world we're living in, learning will not be about the classroom. Learning should not be about the location, but the ability for a student and a teacher and that umbilical link between the two to continue. And that always starts with leadership. I'd like to ask you just to pause for a second, and it'll give me a perfect time to have a slurp of my coffee. And just think for a moment. Just reflect on the greatest single act of leadership that you as a professional has ever achieved. Just for a moment, think about that. My guess is that that moment came along. My guess is that that wasn't by management by committee. And I'm not talking about not listening to members on your team who have other skill sets, but I'm guessing your greatest demonstrative role of leadership came at a time, 1, under great pressure, and 2, a decision that you took alone. And if you think about that as you move forward, leadership is not a team sport, as I've already said. But leadership is not something that is also given with title. Leadership is truly practiced when people follow you. And everybody in times of stress or difficulty look to leadership. The next thing that is so important is equity. And equity was something that really was one of the founding pillars of my idea when we started to work on Edwin, which was September the 16th, 2016, which was the day that I joined Nelson. So equity to me is something that is a level playing field for all people. And when I look in school classrooms across this country, and when you look at the statistics from StatsCan, over 28% of this country's students live below the poverty line. How is that equitable? When I looked at technology in a classroom and the ability to access technology, there are 2.8 children per 1 device. How is that equitable? When I looked at forward-thinking schools who said the solution was BYOD, and I looked in a classroom and there is somebody on a MacBook Pro Rose Gold 2016 edition, and somebody to the left of them with an old Dell Inspiron that was probably handed down from their father that weighed about 16 pounds, and across from them, somebody with no device at all. I say, how is BYOD equitable? And think about this. This is the Atlantic Education Summit. If we cannot create equity in the classroom, what chance do we have in society? We must create equity. Equity is something that gives the world the ability to choose the next leader of the free world. Socioeconomic pigeonholing comes from inequity. Oh, little Johnny's father does this for a living and his mother does that. He'll end up in this stream. Many teachers subconsciously pigeonhole because of socioeconomics, because of race, and because of inequity. Not given the ability to do something could end up leading the greatest leader the society has ever not known behind. So think about the first slide, leadership. Your ability to access leadership, to become that leader, to save the free world, to create equity, comes from equity itself. So when we look at the decisions we make, think, are they equitable? Am I giving every one of my students, every one of my teachers, every one of my administration, and every parent of my students an equitable solution? Think about access to Wi-Fi. Think about the ability to learn when you're told you cannot come back into school the second week in September because we've seen a second spike. Leadership is about understanding every eventual outcome and meeting it with an eventual solution, an equitable solution. The future. This doesn't mean that Nelson's going into space exploration, but I wanted to put this up just so you understand that leadership and equity is about envisioning the future. Great companies, great leaders, and great equitable solutions can envision the future, can imagineer a solution to a problem in the future. If you think about world-changing technologies that we all use every single day, they were answering a question to a problem in the future before we knew it was a creation, before we knew it was a desired outcome to equal a problem of the future. And that's where we are today. The only thing we know about the future right now is that it's unsure. We believe there'll be blended classrooms. We believe there'll be stop learning. We believe that we have to get our students to be able to learn wherever their geographic location. And we have a solution for that. But to do that, we really have to understand geography. We have to understand infrastructure. We have to envision and envisage the problem which is going to come. And we have to understand every single part of the educational community, the teacher and the stress that we're putting on teachers. Teachers aren't paid enough to get that stress. The relationship between teacher and student is the most important one. How can you do that when they're no longer in the classroom? The relationship between the student and their learning has to be one when they're outside the classroom as well as inside the classroom is engaging, or the student will disengage. And if the student disengages, and certain grades show this, grades 6, 7, and 8, if a student disengages at that point because they do not find the methodology of learning relevant to every other aspect of their life, they'll disengage and we'll lose them forever. The step that we made earlier this year to withdraw after being the largest single provider of learning materials to post-secondary was because of that. Because I knew that if we were going to be truly world-class with our Edwin platform, we had to be singularly focused. And people weren't going to go from school education, from K to 12, from middle school and high school, and transfer their learning into a post-secondary institution unless they enjoyed learning, unless their engagement drove outcomes and outcomes drove the opportunity to be able to do anything they wanted in their life. They were going to say, I don't need to go to post-secondary education. I don't enjoy school. So we have to create the ability to engage in learning materials to truly be able to get students to engage. And later in the presentation, I'll show you some statistics and how that's possible. But don't underestimate this space page. The future is the answer to every problem we have today. You just have to have the ability to imagine what could come. And I find that a stimulating question. It should not be one that drives fear or anxiety or uncertainty, but one of opportunity, one of change, a catalyst to be able to change exactly what we're doing now. The Socratic method of teaching and learning has got a new hurdle, but we have solutions. So when we talk about the COVID shift, let's talk a little bit about where we as an educational community went, where we decided, okay, that's a solution to where we are. What can we do now? So here it is. Flipgrid, Zoom, and Google Classroom. Exponential growth and adoption, everybody's solution to everything learning. No. Nice tools, very useful. We work with them all the time. I'm presenting to you now on Zoom. A solution to education? No. Another tool to help you bridge a potential chasm between the kitchen and the classroom? For sure. Helpful? Yes. The answer? I fear not. The interesting thing when we started on the Edwin journey, as I said, we talked about equity, 2.8 students per one device. The predominance of those devices lay resident in the classroom. That means for 2/3 of their active life, Monday to Friday, they lay dormant. We said, no, get every kid a device, get every device the same, and give every kid the level playing field. And now, 3 years later, a growing acceptance that a one-to-one classroom goal is the aim. I know that Dell, who we work very closely with on the Edwin platform, are now struggling to get enough devices into the marketplace. I've spoken with educational boards and ministries across this country who are all saying, Steve, can you help us get devices? We need more devices. We have a bad device ratio per student. A good thing. COVID delivered a good thing. In 2020, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, physical devices will be extremely important to access learning materials. So that's a great step. That's a positive from COVID. If we can draw positives from a dreadful global pandemic, this is one. So what's missing? When we're talking about devices, we're talking about links with Zoom and Google Classroom. What's missing is content. Content is king, and it's what engages students. And I'll show you some statistics on that. So when we look, people say, okay, great, we've got a solution for content. Google. No. Google as a search engine is very useful when you want to find great sushi. Google's very interesting when you want to understand the population of downtown Toronto and its expansion compared to the rest of the cities in the world. But it's driven by search engine optimization. Google is not a safe sandbox for learning. If kids type in a question and they want to get an answer and they go to Wikipedia, that's affected media. So that is not the answer. We have to give kids a safe sandbox to play in, particularly when they're not in the classroom. When they don't have Steve over their shoulder as the teacher saying, no, come on, back on track. But let's look at trusted materials, curriculum aligned and tagged materials, allowing students an exploration in safety can be learning no matter what your location. And that's what we tried to do when we created Edwin. I spoke to somebody at 4:30 this morning in Turin. And for those of you who don't know what Edwin is, I'll give you a very brief demo this morning, because this is really about the transformation of what we perceive as the classroom. And a classroom without walls, your ability to learn wherever you are. But today, Edwin's being used from Toronto to Turin, from Calgary to Cairo. And the engagement numbers that I'll show you are from 50,000 students from January the 1st this year until the end of May. Pre-COVID, during COVID, and approaching post-COVID. The idea of Edwin was to allow a student the ability to search around materials with curriculum-aligned product, to not travel out to make your work product like notes or Excel, to be able to search in a multidisciplinary fashion, not to be just within the discipline of the subject. And it's about transforming your classroom. It's about engaging everybody in an equal fashion to create a learning product of the future. That's what I told my team in September 2016. We didn't know that COVID was coming. But what I did know is a child engages in learning when they want to learn. And when they want to learn, comprehension level soars. How did you know that, Steve? You were 3 days into education. Because it's the same as everything else in life. If you play tennis and you play once a month, or you play golf and you play once a month, compared to playing any of those sports every single day with a desire to get better, your learning curve is steeper. Education's no different. Think about my opening. Every industry I've worked in said the same thing. You don't understand, Steve, that's not how it works. I ran a business that made 3 billion DVDs, CDs, and Blu-ray discs a year. My first day at the job, I told my technology team, I want you to invent me the ability to be able to transact on my phone, and I want you to email me a movie. They told me I was crazy, that would never be done. You can't email a movie, Steve, the data file is too big. I said, find a way. They said, Steve, you don't understand. I said, I'll find somebody else who can do the job if you can't. Look at what you do today on Netflix. It's normal. Look at what you do on Apple TV. It's normal. Amazon Prime. You can transact and move content around seamlessly without thinking. That's what Edwin was all about. So, what is Edwin? Edwin is all your learning in one place. It's the ability to engage and stay engaged until you come out of learning. It gives students the ability to seamlessly integrate all of these tools and products and learning and all of this deep thousands and thousands of learning objects, which are deconstructed from textbooks, from videos, to the ability to talk to it and have it transcribe that into typed product, to listen to it, to read a book to you. However your learning style, Edwin will meet you there. Equity. For teachers, it allows them to create work product for students to work within, to give them a starting point and a potential finishing point, and let them work out the learning journey in between when they work through it. Whether you're in the kitchen or the classroom, that umbilical link, that societal, dreadfully important relation between educator and student, ambiguous to location. If you're a teacher, think about your journey over the last 12 weeks. Your inability to talk to communicate with, and to understand what your students are doing. Edwin will give you that. We didn't know about COVID, but the solution to 21st century learning covers a myriad of problems. So there are various things about Edwin Classroom, the path to the classroom, starting quickly. There is no learning journey with Edwin. It's very straightforward. Whether you're a self-prescribed Luddite or you're a tech-forward genius, your ability to be able to navigate around it is as easy as an iPhone. And for those of you who've got iPhones, you know very well when you open up that box, you turn it on, you navigate around it because it's intuitive. It's easy. You know where to go to find things, and you get better and better at the more you use. That's what we created with Edwin. Today, Edwin's used by over 50,000 students. We believe now with the numbers that we're signing up, that's going to be close to 100,000 by September when we get back to schools. We're in 8 provinces, we'll be 9 in September, we're in 7 countries today, and we'll be in 9 countries starting in August. The feedback is resounding. Students like it. Parents love it. Teachers think it's the greatest tool of ever. Obviously, when it starts, you get certain teachers. We had one recently, and I know that this is a story, but I spoke to a teacher in Northern Ontario. They launched in September last year. I went to visit the school because I love being in Edwin classrooms. I love being in all classrooms, but I loved being in Edwin classrooms because when I see genuine joy on a student's face when they're talking about learning, that excites me. This teacher said to me, Steve, I think this is great, but I just spoke to our director, and he was in the classroom earlier knowing you were visiting, and I said to him, why couldn't you launch this next year? I retire in June. And she said, you know, Steve, I've been a teacher for 38 years. I really didn't need another bell and whistle. And I said, try it. Katie, try it. See what you think. And she said, I'll try anything, particularly when I don't have a choice. And I said, well, let me know. I'll come back and see you. I went up at Christmas and just before the Christmas break, and I went to Katie's classroom. And she said, why didn't you invent this 30 years ago? This is the greatest thing that I've ever used. My students are engaged. My outcomes are soaring. My job is easier. You have saved me time. And she said, I don't even use a phone. She said, I still have this. And she showed me a flip phone. She said, all I use it for is to get phone calls from my children. This tool will change education. And I'm sorry that I'm retiring. And this wasn't with me for my journey. That is when you get product advocates from teachers who didn't think they really wanted it. To me, that's the most important part. So the impact is immeasurable, and I'll walk you through some of these things. And customer voice, rather than me taking up more time on this, go to edwin.nelson.com, and there's a section called stories. Watch some of those videos. They're really, really impactful. But this is just a few comments that really mirror the one I was just talking about, Katie's voice, whether it's teacher, whether it's principal, whether it's the director of education, whether it's the minister of ed, or whether it's the deputy minister. Edwin's life-changing. It pivots, it breaks down paradigms. It allows you to work in a 21st century method that engages students, that drives outcomes, that creates ease for teachers, that gives principals the ability to measure against Edwin classrooms and grades against non-Edwin classrooms and grades, which then has an impactful measure to move forward. There are various different things, and we can make this all available. But I think this is a society, a group of educators from the Atlantic provinces. And I wanted to show you just some statistics, because I believe that statistics, as we know, the only real measure in education is student outcome. To drive outcome, you have to drive competency. And to drive competencies, we need to see which area of competency that is driven. So this is just in excess of 3,600 students, 3,600 something students surveyed through their class teachers. This is grades 6, 7, and 8 data, which was done just prior to the December break, so winter 2019. Competencies that is being driven in terms of the student creating new competencies and growing in competencies in those areas. 3,600 kids. Over 60% of teachers said independent work. Over 50% of teachers said organization. Look at these statistics. Digital literacy, responsibility, collaboration, one-to-one technical learning, driving greater collaboration. I'll show you how that works. Self-confidence, relative regulation, and creativity. Great statistics. And we have, believe me, statistics coming out the wazoo. This is the most impactful slide I think I've got for you today. So this is 50,000 kids globally, across those countries and classrooms we talked about. 199,000 hours of engagement. Engagement is, and I'll do a small Edwin demo for you in a moment, I'll keep it very brief, but engagement is not just opening up your device, or when you're on a software only Edwin, being sat on your desktop or your own laptop at home, but 199,315 hours divided by 50,000 students, what's that? 3.5 hours per engaging hour per day for students. Engagement is not just opening your device, being on an Edwin learning object or in Edwin notes, or it's actually gesticulation of content. It's actually working with content, reading content, scrolling content, copy and pasting, highlighting, or typing. So it's actually real work, true engagement. 199,000 hours. February, 170,000 hours. So you've gone from whatever that is, 3.8 to 3.5 hours of engagement per student per day. Then we got to March, and you can see there's a slight altering of that chimney. The number that you see just pointing out either side actually read 122,000 hours for March. So we looked at that and thought, okay, COVID started, schools are closed, we get it. It's 120,000 hours. It's still pretty good, 2 hours and something per student of engagement in learning objects in Edwin. But then we started to dig down into that number. The reason it was 120,000 hours was spring break. The first 2 weeks of March, we saw a massive drop down in terms of the total number of hours. But the second 2 weeks in March, we actually saw a huge spike. So when we extrapolate that usage and divide by 14 and divide by 10 and multiply by 20, we actually do it by weekends as well. So it is 14 and 28. The actual number of hours that students were engaging in learning materials at home on Edwin was equal to or greater than pre-COVID days. So we thought, wow, that's amazing. That's powerful statistics. But 1 month is not exactly a trend. But look at the months of April and look at the months of May. 50,000 students who work on Edwin, who engage in Edwin, who are assigned learning materials from their teachers on Edwin, are working equal to or greater than the number of hours as they did when they were in the classroom. That's the power of Edwin, that's the power of technology. But the most important part is that's the power of meeting students in a learning methodology that speaks to them. People do things they enjoy. When students are enjoying learning, their exploration goes up. You create a safe sandbox, so no matter what they're exploring in, it's tied to provincial curriculum. You can allow kids to tumble in learning and knowing they'll come out the other side safe, but smarter. That's one of the huge advantages of Edwin. So with that, I will now endeavor to share my screen and give you a very brief, I'll keep this to a few minutes. And if anybody's interested afterwards, we can certainly get you in touch with one of my team. But let's see if I share my screen here and go to Edwin. So this is Edwin. Edwin is everything in one place. So Edwin isn't to replace your SMS, your SIS or your LMS, but it's to link in, to API link into it. Over here on this side, you have most recently viewed. So these are all learning objects that I have a student I've linked in with most recently. We used to have this over here with the individual disciplines across the bottom. But then what we found as we start to engage with students and measure how many hours students go to certain places and where they visit most often, putting most recently read resources on this side, what we found is unanimously, students go back to a learning resource they most recently interacted with. So we just put them up straight in front of them. Across the top, you have, again, most recently viewed. Then you have here your calendar. So obviously at the moment the teachers are just finished. We've got nothing in my calendar. I think I'm in an Ontario school right now. Normally this would say, you know, lessons or whatever, dentist appointment, soccer practice. And then here you have your assignment. So if I'm a teacher and I put an assignment out to my students, it comes in here. Let's go into a couple of learning objects. So you have an ability, I'll show you two search engines. I'm going to keep this very short, but I'm so passionate about Edwin. Once I get into the product, I get carried away. So I'll keep on task. You have the ability to be able to search up the discipline. So you go to mathematics, what you have is something akin to a table of contents in a textbook. This is a teacher variant. So over here, you actually have the curriculum strands that you need to satisfy when you're in this particular area of mathematics. That the right-hand side doesn't show to a student, but all the learning objects are tied to curriculum strand, and I'll show you some more about that in a moment. If you open up one of the learning objects, you go in, this one's a video, I've chosen a bad one, let me choose another one. Let's go into factors and exponents. So you open up factors and exponents. This is an Ontario grade 7 classroom. You've got 20 learning objects, 3 different videos, all tied to curriculum. You open it up. That little blue line that you just saw was taking this learning object from being resident on the cloud to resident on your device. So now you've got an online, offline learning object. So if I'm in a classroom or if I'm in a connected area, I can open this learning object and work within it. But tonight when I go home, I talked about equity. I'm in a low socioeconomic area. I don't have Wi-Fi at home, but I can still work on this material because it's now resident on the device. So I can work within the learning material. One of the things that we wanted to do, in fact, I'm going to go back. So that's one learning methodology, searching within the discipline. Another one is to search multidisciplinary. Let's just choose one I've already done, water. So if I search for water, that then brings up 213 learning objects and 88 videos across all of these different learning objects, all of these different disciplines. So water may be on geography, social sciences, science, history, mathematics. If you want to learn about water, you can go and learn in many multidisciplinary fashions, or if you want, you can narrow it down to individual learning subjects. But I think that for the demonstration, what I'll talk about is the ability to look at this. A teacher can say, that's great, maybe I'll assign this one. They can open it up and say, tell me more about this learning object. It'll tell you about the learning objects, and it'll also show the curriculum strands that it satisfies. You also have the ability to assign it. Click of one button, assign this learning object, and then say, I would like you to start and give me an overview of 20th century water and the effects it has on society around the world. Give me a 500-page essay or whatever it may be by assigning these learning objects, all at the click of one button. For a student, they may want to just hover over it and see. But if you open up the learning object, again, there you see it going from resident in the cloud to resident on the device. To download a learning object in a standard Wi-Fi connected area takes 0.1 to 0.3 of a second. Equalization of society in a heartbeat. One of the things that I looked at when we were looking at learning materials in a digital fashion was everything is based around a single discipline or a single publication. Putting a book into a digital format is not 21st century learning. When I looked at how people interacted with learning objects in a digital fashion, there was too much travel. What do I mean by that? Traveling to and traveling from is not efficient. It's a waste of learning time. I look at everything in terms of efficiency, even learning. So if I wanted to read this particular learning object, then I was told to give my overview on the understanding of it. I would go from the physical learning object on the digital format out to Word or Google Docs or whatever it be, and then keep traveling back and forth. And I said, how can that be efficient? We need to be able to work alongside our learning. So we created Edwin Notes. So you can create your own notes right alongside. You can go into Edwin and say, okay, I'm going to take that, color code the copy and paste, tie that in, bring that into your work product. Yellow, maybe I'm going to include that in my essay. Pink, maybe I want to research that further. You can actually go into individual words and find out what they may mean. Let me try and find one. Dissolve. You can go into a word whilst you're reading it and doing your notes. Click on the question mark, find out what it means. Definition unavailable. That's great. Normally that ties straight into the Nelson dictionary, and it'll tell you what it means. You get the ability to get it to read to you by pressing the play button, or all of this you can go up and use as similar to a podcast.
Dissolve. What is water?
Where you can get it
water
to read.
Is a very useful.
You can get it to read to you, go back or forth. You can change the gender or the language, and you're working with Edwin. So whilst you're in a learning object on Edwin, you may say, okay, you've started your student off in this subject, 25 kids in the class, but you're told to engage with other learning materials in other disciplines. You can go to the recommendation engine, and it will drive you not only to the keyword of water, but the areas that you're reading or you're looking at right now, tied to that same curriculum strand in a multidisciplinary fashion. It recommends all of these other learning objects. So all of your kids in the class may go off down 25 different rabbit holes for you to understand. We've got some metacognitive questions, self-check. Do I understand? Am I still working on it? How that ties in. And you've also got those big 3-inch ring binders when you used to buy our textbooks, all of the learning materials built in for the educator tool, which give you lesson plans and various other things all tied in for Edwin. That's obviously for teachers only. When you do those metacognitive checks, it summarizes it so teachers can see how much time I'm spending, what's the average time, what's my level of understanding, how many self-checks do I do, and so forth. So as you can see, it's very functional. There are many, many, many more tools, but one I want to show you before I finish is we all know that not every kid is created equal. So when you go into Edwin and you go into user settings, you get the ability to go in and manage your resources. You can choose your individual province, because we're in every province in terms of got the curriculum in there. This is a grade 7, 8, 9 library that we've got running right now. But if Steve's only meeting at a grade 6 level, I can go into grade 6 and I can choose grade 6 in language and bring in grade 6 resources and save that. Previously, as a teacher, I would have walked down the classroom to my grade 6 class from my grade 8 class, borrowed a grade 6 reading resource, and now little Stevie sat in the class reading the grade 6 resource, totally ostracized from the rest of his class. Now at the press of a button, whether it's a struggling student or a soaring student, you get to go in and give them the learning materials that they need. So that's a very, very brief elevator view of Edwin. I'll go back to my presentation and get this wrapped up, and then we can move to questions and answers. So that was the demo on Edwin. To close before we've got questions and answers, this is a large statement, but it's one I take very seriously. And this says the word duty, our duty as leaders in education to build a path to equity. I don't think that word is correct, and I was going to change it this morning, but I thought I'd actually say it. The word that I believe is obligation. We have an obligation to ensure that learning is created in an equitable fashion for all students, for all teachers, and for all parents. For God's sake, if the world ever needed great leadership, it's now. And only education is going to provide it. And I think that we are up to the task. So please do follow me on Twitter. I'd be delighted to take any questions. It was my pleasure to talk to you today. I hope the rest of the conference is much better than my presentation. I don't think that's much of a stretch to believe it will be. And with that, I'll gladly take any questions. Thank you very much, Brian.
Steve, thank you so much. That was amazing. And I'll do a shameless plug. We actually are going to have Edwin on My Creative Classroom podcast next week to dive into the features and everything that has been used for during COVID-19, the pandemic, and post and even before. So that's fantastic. So we do have a few questions for you, Steve. I'll start over on the side here. One is from William, and it says, using Edwin, do students have the ability to curate their own content? And the follow-up to that is, we know that student-driven learning is the key. So this is important. As a follow-up, if students can curate their own content, how does Edwin or the teacher push the student into directions that are uncomfortable to encourage new learning?
That is a great question. And let me show you that. That's a feature I did not show you. It will literally take me 30 seconds. Share. So this is a feature called collections, and we send out collections. This is Indigenous Structures, Treaties, Truth and Reconciliation. You see some here, elections. So right before the elections in November, we sent out a collection pre-curated by our educational publishing team at Edwin, Black History Month. But the question about self-curation is a great one. So we created your collections, and what you see in your collections are collections that are created by Edwin. They have the banner across the top. You see some here that have this black banner across the bottom, edited. And you see one here. This is actually Mario. Mario and I were in the Yukon for a conference in February the 25th. Mario and I were sat on a bus, and I created my own curated collection. So students, teachers can create these collections. They can edit pre-curated collections, or they can create their own with other links, pulling them from the diary. They can share them with the class or with students in the classroom. Self-curation is one of our absolute beliefs for exploration. That's a great question, and I hope that answers your question. The answer is yes, we do.
That's great. And of course, if anybody has follow-ups to that, you can use the Q&A feature of Zoom to ask some questions. I think we have 10 minutes left, so we'll keep going. So we have another question here, which says, New Brunswick has adopted Office 365. Can these platforms complement each other?
Yes. So one of the initial tasks for my team was that it had to be agnostic to LMS or operating system. So we tie into Google Classroom, to Brightspace, to D2L, to OS 365. Edwin works on any platform, iOS, Google, Android, Mac. It works on every single platform and ties in. It's totally agnostic. We do not want you to have to spend anything more on technology systems or infrastructure just because you adopt Edwin. It works with everything equally as well.
Fantastic. Mireille writes, how does Edwin help with collaboration and or teacher and peer feedback?
So in two ways. Within Edwin, you have the ability to create sub-cohorts. So teachers can share. I just showed you those features in terms of collections, and I showed you how to assign. You can sub-cohort your classroom. You can communicate with groups of 4, groups of 6, groups of 2. You can create individual assignments for individual students or groups. You can share those through assignments or through collections. So the collaboration tools, one of the things that you saw on competency increasing was collaboration. We've actually seen students through COVID being created in cohorts who are living up to 60, 70, 80 miles away from each other and working seamlessly as a team. Then the teacher gets to measure the engagement and the work product in that dashboard that I showed you. Who did what? What did Steve and Brian have been put together by Dr. Mario Chesson to do a project? How much of it did Steve do and how much of it did Brian really do? And go back and forth. And when you're sharing those collections and you go into the Edwin notes I showed you, I can actually edit your notes and you can edit mine. We can see the individual areas and we can meld them together. Collaboration is a thing for the workplace that is drastically underestimated. And unless we teach kids collaboration, we will not be creating people to go forward and drive GDP in this country or any other. So I believe collaboration is one of the single biggest strengths.
And a great feature for everyone using the platform. Obviously, like you said, collaboration is a great strength. We have another question here is, what other languages is the platform available in?
So the operating system, and in that the managed settings, there's a toggle in there for French or English. We're currently working on other languages to be able to globalize. At the moment, it's either being used in English across the world or English and French. And Nova Scotia actually in September will be the first province to use the French system. So there's French content going in and being tagged right now. And obviously the system is bilingual and translates everything into French in terms of the operating keys on the dashboard. So right now, English and French and other languages to come.
And you mentioned that, and as you showed us, the curriculum is tied to the province.
Yes.
Are all of the curriculums, like are all of the provincial curriculums now loaded into the Edwin platform?
Yeah, so currently we have coast to coast to coast, all 10 provinces. We have grades 6 to 9. In Ontario, we're up 6 to 10, and we'll finish off all provinces at 6 to 12 over the next 18 months. As you can imagine, tagging that amount of content to curriculum alignment, which is individually aligned, including all new content. So for example, Ontario announced yesterday its new math content. So as that comes out, we'll be putting all the new Ontario math content and tagging it. It's hundreds of thousands of man hours and many, many, many millions of dollars. But currently every province, including the 4 Atlantic provinces, are available grades 6 to 9.
That's fantastic, Steve. If anybody has other questions, I think we've gone through most of them through the chat window as well as in the Q&A section. I don't see any others. So, Steve, I thank you so much for your presentation today. It's such a great program, a software, a resource for educators. As you look at, and you mentioned, it's all curated within this one area. And instead of having to, back in the days, Alt-Tab to switch windows to go into a Word doc and then back to your search menu, is so fantastic that everything is built in and that there's this ability to switch between grades as well as the provincial curriculums are all tied in there as well. So it's so great to hear about Edwin by Nelson and what it offers educators and the stories, like you mentioned, going to the website to listen to those stories, those videos of real life applications of educators who have been using it and have experienced that transformational way of thinking and teaching. So before we take off from our session here, is there anything else that you'd like to add, Steve?
Yeah, it's the alignment of what's gone on, and Edwin, I agreed to talk at this conference beforehand. I thought it was so much more important. And it wasn't about a shameless plug for Edwin at all. It was about a tool to be able to aid parents, teachers, and students as we go forward into September. And that's the community. And I don't think we can forget those teachers and the pressure that they're put with under. But equally, we've got to work with students to get them engaged so they don't disengage. Your job is hard enough in the regular classroom. This just makes it that much more difficult. We are there riding alongside you. We wish you luck and Godspeed. And if there's anything we can do for you, we've worked with you in this country for 106 years. And now I'm very sure we'll be with you for another 106. So thank you very much for the opportunity. It was great talking to you today.
Thanks again, Steve, and I appreciate you taking the time of your day to provide this keynote for the Atlantic Education Summit. And I encourage everyone to follow you on social media. And if they have further questions, reach out to Steve through social media about Edwin, and go check out their website. I think it's great. And shameless plug again, we're going to have Edwin by Nelson on the podcast, and we'll dig deeper into what it is and what it has to offer educators. So Steve, on behalf of the Atlantic Education Summit, once again, thank you so much for your presentation, and to all the participants here. We will see you in the virtual reality for the keynote by David Whelan. Thank you all, and we'll see you later.
Bye-bye.